on the west bank of the Nile, across the river from the modern city of Luxor. Two enormous stone figures sit in silence at the edge of the floodplain. They are roughly 18 meters tall, each one carved from a single block of quartzite, weighing approximately 720 tons. They have sat in this spot for more than 3,400 years, enduring floods, earthquakes, vandalism, and the slow, patient assault of wind and sand. Their faces are damaged, their details are blurred. The inscriptions that once identified them have been partially effaced by time, but they remain immovable, the last visible remnants of a structure that was, when it stood, the largest religious building in the history of ancient Egypt. These are the colossi of Memnon. They once flanked the entrance to a mortuary temple so vast that it dwarfed every other temple in the Nile Valley, including the great temple of Amun at Karnak. The temple covered an area of approximately 35 hectares. Its courts were lined with hundreds of statues. Its walls were decorated with scenes of royal triumph and divine communion. Its pylons rose to heights that would not be equaled by any subsequent Egyptian construction, and today, apart from the two colossi and a scattered field of broken stone, it is gone. Not buried, not hidden, gone. Quarried for its stone by later pharaohs who needed building material for their own projects, dismantled block by block over centuries, until nothing remained but the two great seated figures, too massive to move, too heavy to break, too stubborn to disappear. The man who built that temple, the man whose image those colossi were carved to represent, was Amenhotep III, the ninth pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. He ruled Egypt for approximately 38 years during the 14th century before the Common Era. His reign was the longest, the wealthiest, and by most measures the most culturally productive of any pharaoh in the New Kingdom. He presided over a civilization at its absolute zenith, a moment when Egypt was not merely the most powerful nation in the ancient world, but arguably the most sophisticated, the most artistically accomplished, and the most diplomatically connected society on earth. And the world has largely forgotten him. The irony is profound. Amenhotep III's grandson, Tutankhamun, is the most famous pharaoh in history, known to virtually every person on the planet, his golden mask an icon of the ancient world. Yet Tutankhamun accomplished almost nothing during his brief and unremarkable reign. He was a child king who died young, whose principal historical significance lies in the fact that his tomb was discovered intact in 1922, providing the modern world with a spectacular display of pharaonic wealth. Amenhotep III, by contrast, was one of the most consequential rulers in the history of civilization, a man who reshaped the political, artistic, and religious landscape of the ancient world during nearly 4 decades of uninterrupted power. He produced more statues of himself than any other pharaoh, more than 700 by some estimates. He built temples across Egypt and Nubia. He maintained diplomatic relationships with every major power in the ancient Near East. He presided over an era of such extraordinary prosperity that the wealth flowing into Egypt from trade, tribute, and the gold mines of Nubia seemed, to contemporaries, essentially limitless. And yet, when people think of ancient Egypt, they think of pyramids, or Tutankhamun, or Cleopatra. They do not think of Amenhotep III, the man who ruled Egypt at the peak of its power, who embodied the fullest expression of pharaonic civilization, who built on a scale that rivaled the pyramid builders of the Old Kingdom, is a footnote in the popular imagination, overshadowed by figures who were, by any objective measure, far less significant. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand why this matters. Not merely as a historical curiosity, not merely as an interesting fact about ancient Egypt, but as a case study in one of the most important and least understood phenomena in human civilization: the relationship between wealth, power, and the preservation of knowledge. Amenhotep III's Egypt was the richest society in the ancient world. It possessed resources that would have been the envy of any civilization before or since. And yet the knowledge that sustained that wealth, the administrative expertise, the diplomatic sophistication, the artistic traditions, the religious understanding, the institutional memory that held the entire system together, proved to be as fragile as the papyrus on which it was recorded. Within a generation of Amenhotep's death, his son Akhenaten would launch a religious revolution that would tear apart the very institutions his father had built. Within 2 generations, the dynasty would be extinct. Within 3 centuries, the empire would be diminished beyond recognition. The wealthiest civilization in the ancient world could not buy its way out of the fundamental vulnerability that afflicts all human knowledge, the vulnerability of depending on people, on institutions, on chains of transmission that can be broken by war, revolution, neglect, or the simple passage of time. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. The story of Amenhotep III is a story about the summit of human achievement and the dizzying speed with which that summit can be lost. It is a story about a civilization that had everything: wealth, power, knowledge, security, stability, and that lost nearly all of it within a few decades. It is a story about the things that gold cannot buy and the things that stone cannot preserve. And it is a story about us, about the assumptions we make regarding progress and permanence, about the illusion that wealth protects and that monuments endure. The colossi of Memnon sit in the morning light, facing east, watching the sun rise over the Nile as they have watched it rise every morning for more than 3,400 years. The temple they once guarded is gone. The man they represent is forgotten. The civilization they embodied is a ruin. And the knowledge that built all of it, the living, breathing, institutional knowledge that transformed stone and gold into the greatest civilization the ancient world ever produced, has vanished as completely as the morning mist that rises from the river and dissolves in the heat of the Egyptian sun. No, let's begin. The Egypt that Amenhotep III inherited was a civilization that had been building toward its zenith for more than a century. The 18th dynasty, founded by the warrior pharaoh Amos I after the expulsion of the Hyksos invaders around 1550, before the Common Era, had transformed Egypt from a regional kingdom into a continental empire through a sustained campaign of military expansion, diplomatic engagement, and institutional development that was unprecedented in Egyptian history. The pharaohs who preceded Amenhotep, Thutmose I, Thutmose III, Amenhotep II, and his own father Thutmose IV, had waged wars, forged alliances, extracted tribute, and built the administrative infrastructure that allowed Egypt to project power across thousands of kilometers of territory. The military tradition that these pharaohs had built was one of the most impressive achievements of the ancient world. Thutmose III, Amenhotep's great-great-grandfather, had conducted 17 military campaigns in 20 years, never losing a battle, expanding the Egyptian empire to its greatest territorial extent. His campaigns in the Levant and Syria had established a system of vassal governance that allowed Egypt to control distant territories through a network of client kings who owed their positions to Egyptian patronage and who maintained their loyalty through a combination of economic incentive, cultural assimilation, and the ever-present threat of military intervention. The administrative and diplomatic knowledge required to maintain this system was enormous, encompassing not only military expertise but also linguistic ability, cultural sensitivity, economic analysis, and the subtle art of managing relationships with proud and often fractious local rulers. Amenhotep II. Amenhotep III's grandfather had maintained this system through a combination of diplomatic engagement and occasional displays of military force that reminded the vassal states of the consequences of disloyalty. His campaigns, though less numerous than those of Thutmose III, were characterized by a brutality that served a deliberate strategic purpose to establish a reputation for ruthless efficiency that would deter future rebellion. The inscriptions that record his campaigns describe the execution of captured princes, the impaling of enemies on the walls of their own cities, and the display of enemy bodies as a warning to potential rebels. Whether these descriptions are accurate or exaggerated for propaganda purposes, their intent is clear: to create an atmosphere of deterrence that would reduce the need for actual military intervention. Thutmose IV, Amenhotep III's father, represented a significant shift in Egyptian foreign policy. His reign saw the conclusion of a peace treaty with the Kingdom of Mitanni, Egypt's principal rival in the northern Levant, sealed by the marriage of a Mitannian princess to the Egyptian pharaoh. This diplomatic revolution, which transformed a relationship of military competition into one of strategic partnership, was one of the most significant geopolitical developments of the Late Bronze Age. It established the framework of great power diplomacy that Amenhotep III would inherit and maintain throughout his reign, a framework in which the major powers of the Near East related to each other as equals, exchanging gifts, negotiating marriages, mediating disputes, and maintaining the balance of power through a combination of personal relationships and institutional protocols. The knowledge that sustained this diplomatic framework was complex, specialized, and almost entirely perishable. The diplomats who conducted these negotiations needed to speak or read multiple languages. The Amarna letters, which document the diplomatic correspondence of this period, are written primarily in Akkadian, the international diplomatic language of the Late Bronze Age, rather than in Egyptian. Egyptian diplomats therefore needed competence in a foreign language and a foreign script, competences that required years of specialized training. They needed knowledge of foreign customs, foreign protocols, foreign political systems, and the specific personalities and interests of the foreign rulers with whom they were dealing. They needed strategic judgment, the ability to assess the balance of power, to anticipate the moves of rivals, and to identify opportunities for diplomatic advantage. All of this knowledge was built up over careers that spanned decades and was transmitted from senior diplomats to their juniors through mentorship and shared experience. By the time Amenhotep III came to the throne, probably around 1390 before the Common Era according to standard chronological estimates, the heavy lifting was done. The empire was established, the borders were secure, the tribute was flowing. The gold mines of Nubia were producing wealth on a scale that made Egypt the richest nation in the ancient world. The vassal states of the Levant were paying their annual taxes. The great powers of the Near East, Mitanni, Babylon, Assyria, and the rising Hittite Empire, were engaged in a complex web of diplomatic relationships that kept the peace through mutual deterrence, strategic marriages, and the constant exchange of gifts and correspondence. Amenhotep III did not need to fight for his empire. He needed to manage it, and manage it he did, with a combination of administrative skill, diplomatic finesse, and cultural ambition that transformed Egypt from a military superpower into something more complex and more interesting. A cultural superpower, a civilization that dominated the ancient world not merely through the threat of force but through the power of its art, the sophistication of its diplomacy, the splendor of its court, and the sheer, overwhelming abundance of its material wealth. The economic foundation of this cultural dominance was gold. Egypt possessed, in the mines of Nubia and the eastern desert, the largest known gold deposits in the ancient world. The scale of Egyptian gold production during the New Kingdom was extraordinary. The Amarna letters, the diplomatic correspondence discovered at Tel El, Amarna and dating primarily to the reigns of Amenhotep III and his son Akhenaten, contain repeated references to Egyptian gold that reveal the degree to which the rest of the ancient world coveted it. Tushratta, the king of Mitanni, wrote to Amenhotep asking for gold and noting that in Egypt, gold was as plentiful as dust. The kings of Babylon, Assyria, and other states made similar requests, their letters oscillating between diplomatic courtesy and barely concealed avarice. Gold was the currency of international diplomacy, the medium through which alliances were cemented, marriages were negotiated, and the favor of the Egyptian pharaoh was purchased. The quantity of gold that flowed through the Egyptian economy during Amenhotep's reign is difficult to estimate with precision, but the physical evidence provides some indication of its scale. The burial equipment of Tutankhamun, Amenhotep's grandson, contained approximately 110 kilograms of gold, including the famous death mask, the innermost coffin, and numerous other objects. This was the burial of a minor king who died young and whose tomb may have been assembled in haste. The burial equipment of Amenhotep III himself, prepared for a pharaoh who reigned for nearly 4 decades at the height of Egyptian wealth, would have been incomparably richer, but it is gone. Plundered by tomb robbers in antiquity, its gold melted down and recycled, its treasures dispersed and destroyed. The tomb of Tutankhamun survived because it was small, modest, and buried beneath the rubble from the construction of a later tomb. The tomb of Amenhotep III, larger and more prominent, was stripped clean. The diplomatic system that Amenhotep maintained was one of the most sophisticated networks of international relations in the pre-modern world. The Amarna letters provide our most detailed picture of this system, and what they reveal is a world of extraordinary complexity, a world in which the great kings of Egypt, Mitanni, Babylon, Assyria, and the Hittite Empire addressed each other as brothers, exchanged gifts of staggering value, negotiated marriages between their royal families, mediated disputes between their vassals, and maintained a delicate balance of power through a combination of personal relationships, institutional protocols, and the ever-present possibility of military force. The letters reveal Amenhotep as a master of this diplomatic game. He gave gold generously but strategically, using it as a tool of influence rather than a sign of generosity. He accepted foreign princesses into his harem, cementing alliances with the royal families of Mitanni, Babylon, and Arzawa, but he refused to send Egyptian princesses abroad in return, maintaining the exclusive prestige of the Egyptian royal bloodline. He corresponded extensively with foreign rulers, maintaining the personal relationships that were essential to the functioning of the diplomatic system, while delegating the details of day-to-day administration to a corps of experienced officials who managed the empire's complex affairs. The administrative apparatus that supported this diplomacy was itself a remarkable achievement. Egypt under Amenhotep III was governed by a bureaucracy that combined centralized authority with local flexibility, maintaining control over a territory that stretched from the Fourth Cataract of the Nile to the borders of the Hittite Empire through a system of provincial governors, military garrisons, royal commissioners, and local client kings. The bureaucracy was staffed by trained scribes who had spent years in the temple schools, learning not only how to read and write but how to manage inventories, calculate taxes, conduct censuses, adjudicate disputes, and maintain the complex records that were essential to the functioning of a state of this size and complexity. The scribal tradition of 18th dynasty Egypt was, in effect, a system of institutional memory. The scribes did not merely record information, they preserved it. They copied older texts onto fresh papyrus, maintaining libraries of administrative precedent, legal opinion, medical knowledge, mathematical technique, and literary tradition that connected the present to the past. The houses of life, the temple, based institutions that served as Egypt's primary centers of learning and knowledge production, maintained collections of texts that represented centuries of accumulated expertise in every domain of human activity: medicine, mathematics, astronomy, theology, law, literature, and the arts of governance. But here is the problem. All of this, the gold, the diplomacy, the bureaucracy, the scribal tradition, the houses of life, the entire elaborate structure of knowledge and power that Amenhotep III had built and maintained, rested on foundations that were far more fragile than they appeared. The economic system that sustained Amenhotep's golden age was, in itself, a masterpiece of organizational knowledge. Egypt under the 18th dynasty operated what was essentially a redistributive economy, in which the state, acting through the pharaoh and the temples, collected agricultural surpluses, craft products, and natural resources from the population, stored them in central granaries and warehouses, and redistributed them to pay workers, fund construction projects, support the military, maintain the priesthood, and provision the diplomatic gift exchanges that sustained international relationships. This system required detailed knowledge of agricultural yields, labor requirements, storage capacities, distribution schedules, and the complex accounting procedures necessary to track the flow of goods and services across a territory of continental dimensions. The grain accounting system alone was a marvel of administrative sophistication. The annual Nile flood, which deposited fresh alluvial soil across the floodplain and created the conditions for Egypt's extraordinary agricultural productivity, was the foundation of the entire economy. But the flood varied in height and timing from year to year, and the agricultural surplus depended on the precise relationship between flood height, planting area, crop type, and labor input. The Egyptian administration maintained records of Nile flood heights going back centuries, records that were used to predict agricultural yields, calculate tax assessments, and plan the distribution of resources across the country. These records, maintained by scribes in the Nilometers, the graduated structures used to measure flood heights along the course of the river, constituted one of the longest continuous datasets in the history of science. The records are gone. The Nilometers themselves survive in some cases, but the detailed observational data they generated, the centuries of flood height measurements that constituted an invaluable resource for understanding the long-term behavior of the Nile, have been lost. Modern hydrologists and climate scientists would give a great deal for access to this data, which could provide insights into historical climate variability, flood patterns, and the environmental conditions that shaped one of the most successful agricultural systems in the ancient world. The data existed. The institutions that maintained it existed. The knowledge of how to interpret and apply the data existed. All of it, the data, the institutions, the knowledge, has been consumed by the same processes of decay and institutional collapse that have destroyed the rest of Egypt's documentary heritage. The trade networks that connected Egypt with the wider world during Amenhotep's reign were themselves repositories of knowledge that has been largely lost. Egyptian merchants and agents operated across the entire eastern Mediterranean and the Near East, trading Egyptian products including gold, papyrus, linen, glass, and faience, for the raw materials and luxury goods that the Egyptian economy required, including timber from Lebanon, copper from Cyprus, tin from Central Asia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and incense from the Horn of Africa. The management of these trade networks required knowledge of foreign markets, exchange rates, transport routes, port facilities, seasonal weather patterns, diplomatic protocols, and the specific commercial customs and legal systems of the regions in which Egyptian traders operated. This commercial knowledge was held by families and firms of merchants who had built their expertise over generations. Like the craft knowledge of the artisans and the administrative knowledge of the scribes, it was primarily tacit, embedded in the practices and relationships of the people who possessed it, rather than in any formal written system. When these commercial communities were disrupted by the political upheavals of the Amarna period, by the economic contractions of the late 18th dynasty, by the broader disruptions of the late Bronze Age collapse, their accumulated expertise was dispersed and eventually lost. The religious knowledge that the temple system maintained deserves particular attention because it encompassed not merely theological doctrine, but a vast range of practical knowledge in fields that we would today classify as science, medicine, mathematics, and astronomy. The Egyptian priests were not merely ritual specialists. They were the custodians of the intellectual heritage of the civilization, responsible for maintaining and transmitting knowledge in every domain of human activity. The temples where they served were not merely places of worship. They were universities, libraries, research centers, and administrative headquarters, all combined in a single institutional framework that was funded by the economic resources of the state and supported by the political authority of the pharaoh. The temple at Heliopolis, the ancient center of sun worship near modern Cairo, was particularly important as a center of learning. It is believed to have housed one of the most extensive collections of texts in the ancient world, covering subjects from theology and ritual to medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and history. The temple at Memphis, the administrative capital of Egypt, maintained similar collections focused on administrative and legal knowledge. The temple at Thebes, the religious capital during the New Kingdom, was the center of the cult of Amun, and maintained the ritual texts, astronomical records, and theological treatises that governed the worship of the national god. Each of these institutions represented centuries of accumulated knowledge, maintained by communities of scholars who had devoted their lives to the study and transmission of their respective traditions. The scope of what these institutions knew is hinted at by the fragments that survive. The astronomical knowledge of the Egyptian priests was sufficient to maintain a complex calendar, predict the heliacal rising of Sirius, the star that signaled the annual Nile flood, track the movements of the major planets, and align temple structures with specific celestial phenomena with a precision that continues to impress modern astronomers. The medical knowledge, as documented in the surviving medical papyri, included sophisticated surgical techniques, pharmacological preparations using hundreds of ingredients, diagnostic procedures that distinguished between treatable and untreatable conditions, and a conceptual framework for understanding disease and health that, while different from modern medicine, was internally consistent and practically effective. The mathematical knowledge of the Egyptian scribes extended well beyond the simple arithmetic required for accounting. The mathematical papyri demonstrate competence in the calculation of areas and volumes, the use of fractions, the solution of linear equations, and the application of geometric principles to practical problems of construction and land measurement. The precision with which Egyptian monuments were designed and built, the alignment of temples with astronomical phenomena, and the accuracy of land surveys conducted after the annual Nile flood all testify to a mathematical tradition of considerable sophistication. All of this knowledge, the astronomical, the medical, the mathematical, the theological, the administrative, the commercial, the agricultural, was interconnected, maintained by overlapping communities of practitioners, and transmitted through institutional channels that depended on the continuous functioning of the temple system, the scribal schools, and the economic apparatus that funded them. The system was robust as long as it was maintained, but it was not designed to withstand the kind of systemic disruption that the Amarna Revolution, followed by the political instability of the late 18th dynasty and the eventual decline of the New Kingdom, would impose upon it. The gold came from mines that required constant investment and maintenance. The diplomacy depended on personal relationships that could not survive changes of regime. The bureaucracy depended on a continuous supply of trained scribes, which depended on a functioning educational system, which depended on the economic resources to support it. The houses of life depended on the patronage of the pharaoh and the temples, which depended on the wealth generated by the empire, which depended on the military and administrative systems that maintained it. The entire structure was a web of interdependencies, each element supporting and being supported by every other element. Pull one thread, and the whole web could unravel. The preservation of knowledge in this system was particularly vulnerable because it depended on a medium that is inherently perishable. Papyrus, the material on which the vast majority of Egyptian administrative, literary, and scientific texts were written, is an organic material that decays. In the humid climate of the Nile Delta, where much of Egypt's administrative activity was concentrated, papyrus can deteriorate within decades. Even in the dry conditions of Upper Egypt, papyrus is vulnerable to insects, fire, moisture, and physical wear. Scholars estimate that we possess, at best, perhaps 1 to 2% of the written material that ancient Egypt produced over the course of its 3,000-year history. The rest is gone. The scale of this loss is difficult to grasp. Consider the administrative output of Amenhotep's 38-year reign alone. A functioning bureaucracy governing an empire of several million people across thousands of kilometers of territory generates an enormous volume of documentation, tax records, census rolls, judicial proceedings, military dispatches, diplomatic correspondence, temple inventories, land surveys, construction accounts, supply manifests, personnel records, and the countless other documents required to manage a complex society. If Amenhotep's government produced even a modest volume of documentation each year, the total output over 38 years would number in the hundreds of thousands of individual documents. Of this vast corpus, we possess virtually nothing: a handful of scarabs, some inscriptions on temple walls, the Amarna letters, which were preserved because they were written on clay rather than papyrus, a few scattered references in later texts. The administrative record of the wealthiest and most sophisticated government in the ancient world has been almost entirely destroyed. The numbers are striking. Of the approximately 380 Amarna letters that survive, a significant proportion date to the reign of Amenhotep III, but they represent only one side of the correspondence: the letters received by the Egyptian court from foreign rulers, not the letters sent by the Egyptian court in response. The Egyptian replies, which would have been written on papyrus and filed in the archives of the foreign courts to which they were sent, have not survived. The foreign courts of Mitanni, Babylon, and Assyria maintained their archives on clay tablets, which are far more durable than papyrus. The Egyptian court maintained its archives on papyrus, which is far more perishable. The result is a systematic bias in the surviving record. We have the letters that were sent to Egypt, but not the letters that were sent from Egypt. We hear the voices of Tushratta, Burna, Beriash, and the other foreign kings, but we do not hear the voice of Amenhotep himself. The most powerful ruler in the ancient world is silent, not because he had nothing to say, but because he said it on papyrus, and the papyrus rotted. This asymmetry extends beyond the diplomatic sphere. The temples, palaces, and administrative buildings of Amenhotep's Egypt contained archives, libraries, and collections of texts that documented every aspect of Egyptian life: the religious rituals, the medical practices, the mathematical techniques, the architectural methods, the artistic traditions, the legal precedents, the historical narratives, the literary works that constituted the intellectual heritage of one of the most sophisticated civilizations in human history. These collections were maintained by trained scribes in institutions that had been functioning continuously for centuries. They represented an investment of human effort, an accumulation of knowledge, an infrastructure of learning that was, in its own way, as impressive as the temples and monuments that housed it. And it is gone, not merely damaged or fragmentary, though the fragments that survive are invaluable. Gone. The intellectual output of Egypt's golden age, the fullest flowering of pharaonic civilization, has been reduced to scattered remnants that provide tantalizing glimpses of what once existed, but that cannot reconstruct the whole. We know that the medical knowledge of 18th dynasty Egypt was sophisticated, because the medical papyri that survive from earlier and later periods demonstrate a level of clinical observation and therapeutic practice that would not be matched for millennia. We know that the mathematical knowledge was advanced because the mathematical papyri show competence in arithmetic, algebra, and geometry that exceeded the needs of simple record keeping. We know that the astronomical knowledge was substantial because the alignment of temples and the design of calendars demonstrate a detailed understanding of celestial phenomena. But the specific medical texts, mathematical treatises, and astronomical records of Amenhotep's reign are lost. The knowledge existed. The records existed. The institutions that maintained them existed. And all of it, the knowledge, the records, the institutions, has been consumed by the ordinary processes of decay, destruction, and neglect that have stripped the ancient world of the vast majority of its intellectual heritage. Then something happened that changed everything. But before we reach that moment, we need to understand several more dimensions of Amenhotep's world, because each dimension represents a category of knowledge that was subsequently lost. Queen Tai, Amenhotep's principal wife, was one of the most remarkable women in the history of ancient Egypt. She was not of royal blood. Her father, Yuya, was a provincial official from the town of Akhmim in Upper Egypt. Her mother, Thuya, held priestly titles, but was similarly non-royal. The marriage of the pharaoh to a commoner was unusual, though not unprecedented in Egyptian history, and it suggests either that Amenhotep chose his queen for personal reasons, or that the political circumstances of his accession favored a match with a powerful provincial family. The marriage scarabs that Amenhotep issued to commemorate the union identify Tai's parents by name and title, a detail that some scholars have interpreted as a deliberate assertion of her legitimacy, a public statement that the queen's non-royal origins did not diminish her status. Tai was not a passive consort. The evidence that survives suggests she was a woman of formidable political influence. She appears in diplomatic correspondence, referenced by foreign kings who clearly regarded her as a significant political figure in her own right. After Amenhotep's death, Tushratta of Mitanni wrote directly to Tai, reminding her of the close relationship he had enjoyed with her late husband, and asking her to ensure that his relationship with the new pharaoh, Akhenaten, would be maintained on the same terms. This letter implies that Tai was perceived by foreign powers as a power behind the throne, a person whose influence on policy decisions was sufficient to warrant direct diplomatic engagement. The mummies of Yuya and Thuya, T's parents, were discovered in 1905 in the Valley of the Kings, in a small tomb designated KV-46. The tomb was one of the most intact royal-associated burials found before the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb 17 years later, and the quality of the burial equipment, including gilded coffins, funerary masks, and finely crafted furniture, testifies to the extraordinary status that Amenhotep conferred on his wife's family. The mummies themselves were well preserved, and modern analysis has revealed details about their health, their diet, and their approximate ages at death. But what these physical remains cannot reveal is the political relationship between the royal house and the provincial aristocracy that the marriage represented, the negotiations that preceded it, the expectations that accompanied it, and the impact it had on the distribution of power within the Egyptian court. Amenhotep III celebrated at least 3 said festivals during his reign, elaborate ceremonies of royal renewal that were among the most important events in the pharaonic calendar. The said festival, traditionally held after 30 years of a pharaoh's rule, and then at shorter intervals thereafter, was a complex ritual sequence that included athletic displays, religious ceremonies, the renewal of royal authority, and the symbolic death and rebirth of the king. The festival was designed to demonstrate the pharaoh's continued vitality and fitness to rule, and it served as a public spectacle that reinforced the bond between the king and his people. Amenhotep's said festivals were celebrated on a scale that surpassed any previous observance. They involved the construction of temporary and permanent ceremonial structures, the production of enormous quantities of commemorative objects, and the participation of officials, priests, and dignitaries from across the empire. The festivals were documented in inscriptions and reliefs at multiple sites, including the Temple of Solib in Nubia and the Malkata Palace complex at Thebes. But the ritual texts, the specific prayers, hymns, liturgical sequences, and ceremonial protocols that governed the conduct of the festival were maintained by the priesthood and transmitted through the temple institutions. When those institutions were disrupted by the Amarna Revolution, the detailed knowledge of the said festival ritual, like so much else, was damaged or lost. The Malkata Palace complex, Amenhotep's primary residence during the later years of his reign, provides another window into the scale and sophistication of the civilization he presided over, and another illustration of the knowledge that has been lost. The palace complex covered an enormous area on the west bank of the Nile, south of the mortuary temple, and included residential quarters for the royal family, administrative buildings, audience halls, temples, workshops, and service facilities. The painted plaster that decorated the walls and floors of the palace has been partially recovered by excavators, and it reveals an artistic program of extraordinary beauty, vivid scenes of plant and animal life, geometric patterns, and figural compositions executed with a freedom and naturalism that distinguishes them from the more formal art of the temples. The palace also contained extensive administrative facilities, including archives where the records of the royal household and the imperial government were stored. These archives would have contained the diplomatic correspondence that we now know only from the Amarna letters, along with internal administrative documents, financial records, personnel lists, judicial proceedings, and the many other types of documentation required to manage a government of this size and complexity. The archives are gone. The papyrus on which they were written has decayed. The knowledge they contained, the detailed record of how the most sophisticated government in the ancient world actually functioned on a day-to-day basis, has been irretrievably lost. The international context of Amenhotep's reign adds another dimension to our understanding of what has been lost. The Late Bronze Age, the period from roughly 1600 to 1200 before the Common Era, was one of the most interconnected periods in the history of the pre-modern world. A network of diplomatic, commercial, and cultural relationships linked the great civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East: Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Mitanni, Babylon, Assyria, Mycenaean Greece, and the cities of the Levant and Cyprus. This network facilitated the exchange of goods, ideas, technologies, and artistic influences across vast distances. Egyptian glass has been found in Mycenaean contexts. Mycenaean pottery has been found in Egyptian tombs. Hittite diplomatic texts reference Egyptian practices. Babylonian scientific concepts influenced Egyptian astronomy. The Late Bronze Age was, in its own way, a globalized world, a world in which the major civilizations were aware of each other, interacted with each other, and influenced each other in ways that are only now being fully appreciated by scholars. Amenhotep III sat at the center of this international network. His diplomatic correspondence connected him with every major ruler in the ancient Near East. His gift exchanges circulated objects of extraordinary value and craftsmanship across thousands of kilometers. His marriage alliances linked the Egyptian royal house with the ruling families of Mitanni, Babylon, and Arzawa. His commercial relationships brought the products of distant lands: lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, tin from Central Asia, amber from the Baltic, into the workshops and treasuries of Thebes. The scale and sophistication of this international system is revealed by the Amarna letters, which document a world of complex, multi-layered relationships that required constant management, negotiation, and diplomatic skill. The knowledge required to maintain this system was enormous. The Egyptian diplomats who conducted these relationships needed to know not only the specific circumstances and personalities of the foreign courts they dealt with, but also the broader strategic context, the balance of power between the major states, the shifting alliances and rivalries, the economic interests, the religious sensitivities, and the historical grievances that shape the behavior of each player. This knowledge was built up over decades of continuous diplomatic engagement, held in the minds and files of a core of experienced officials, and transmitted from one generation of diplomats to the next through a combination of formal training and practical experience. When the chain of diplomatic engagement was broken by the Amarna Revolution, when the experienced diplomats of Amenhotep's generation were replaced or marginalized by Akhenaten's new men, the accumulated diplomatic expertise of decades was dissipated. The oral traditions of Amenhotep's Egypt represent yet another category of lost knowledge. Ancient Egypt was not exclusively a literate society. It was also a society in which songs, stories, prayers, medical knowledge, agricultural lore, and practical wisdom were transmitted orally from generation to generation, alongside and sometimes independently of the written record. The written texts we possess are, in many cases, snapshots of oral traditions that were far richer and more varied than any written version can capture. When the oral tradition was disrupted, when the communities that maintained it were dispersed or silenced, the knowledge they carried was lost even more completely than the knowledge preserved on papyrus, because there was no physical record to be found, no fragment to be deciphered, no artifact to be analyzed. The oral knowledge simply ceased to exist. Then something happened that changed everything. The core problem with Amenhotep III is not that we know too little about him. By ancient standards, we know a great deal. We know his name and his titles. We know the length of his reign. We know the identity of his principal queen, Tai, and the names of several of his children. We know the locations of his major building projects. We have some of his diplomatic correspondence, preserved in the Amarna letters. We have his mortuary temple, or rather the ruins of it, and the two colossal statues that once guarded its entrance. We have hundreds of statues that he commissioned, scattered across the museums of the world. We have inscriptions, scarabs, stelae, and relief sculptures that document various events and achievements of his reign. By the standards of ancient Egyptian studies, where many pharaohs are known from little more than a name in a king list or a fragment of an inscription, Amenhotep III is well documented. The problem is that everything we know about him is surface. We have the facade, we do not have the interior. We know what he built, we do not know how his government functioned. We know whom he married, we do not know how he made decisions. We know what gifts he exchanged with foreign kings. We do not know the strategic thinking that guided those exchanges. We have the products of his reign. We do not have the processes. We have the what. We do not have the how or the why. Consider his building program, which was the most ambitious undertaken by any Egyptian pharaoh since the pyramid builders of the Old Kingdom. Amenhotep III built or renovated temples throughout Egypt and Nubia, the Temple of Luxor, the additions to the Temple of Amun at Karnak, the Temple at Soleb in Nubia, and dozens of smaller structures across the Nile Valley. The Temple of Luxor, one of Amenhotep's most significant surviving constructions, provides a particularly clear illustration of the relationship between architecture and knowledge. The temple was not designed merely as a beautiful space for worship. It was a theological document in stone, a three-dimensional text that encoded specific religious ideas about the nature of kingship, the relationship between the pharaoh and the gods, and the cosmic significance of the annual Opet festival, during which the divine essence of kingship was renewed through a procession from Karnak to Luxor. The proportions of the columns, the sequence of the courts, the placement of the reliefs, the orientation of the building within the landscape, all of these were determined by theological principles that guided the architects and that would have been legible to the priests and educated officials who used the building. These theological principles, the rules of temple design that connected architectural form to religious meaning, were part of the knowledge tradition maintained by the houses of life. They were transmitted from master builder to apprentice over generations, refined through practice, and documented in architectural treatises that have not survived. Modern Egyptologists can measure the temples. They can analyze the proportions. They can study the reliefs and read the inscriptions, but they cannot fully recover the theological grammar that governed the design, because the grammar was embedded in a tradition of knowledge that was transmitted alongside the buildings, but that was recorded on perishable media and maintained by institutions that no longer exist. He built his mortuary temple on the west bank of Thebes, the temple whose entrance the Colossi of Memnon once guarded, a structure that was by every measure the largest religious building in Egypt. He built a vast palace complex at Malkata, on the west bank of the Nile south of his mortuary temple, a sprawling compound of residential, ceremonial, and administrative buildings that served as the primary royal residence for much of his reign. He excavated an enormous artificial lake called Birket Habu beside the Malkata Palace, measuring approximately 2 kilometers by 1 kilometer, an engineering project of considerable scale that required the removal of millions of cubic meters of earth. The artificial lake at Malkata deserves particular attention as an example of the engineering knowledge that has been lost. The construction of a body of water of this size in an arid environment required knowledge of hydrology, soil mechanics, waterproofing, and water management that was far from trivial. The lake had to be designed to retain water in a climate where evaporation rates are extremely high. It had to be connected to the Nile to ensure a continuous supply. Its shores had to be stabilized to prevent erosion. The engineering expertise required to design and build this lake was part of the broader tradition of hydraulic engineering that the Egyptians had developed over millennia of managing the Nile flood. And it represents yet another category of specialized knowledge that was maintained by specific communities of practitioners, and that was vulnerable to loss when those communities were disrupted. The construction of these projects required an organizational apparatus of extraordinary sophistication. Architects had to design the structures, quarries had to supply the stone, Transport systems had to move blocks weighing tons, sometimes hundreds of tons, across distances of hundreds of kilometers. Labor forces numbering in the thousands had to be recruited, housed, fed, organized, and directed. Skilled craftsmen, stonecutters, sculptors, painters, carpenters, and metalworkers had to be trained, equipped, and supervised. Administrative staff had to manage the finances, the logistics, the scheduling, and the quality control of projects that spanned years or decades. The coordination required to execute a building program of this scale is comparable to that required for a major military campaign, and in some respects more demanding, because construction projects cannot be abandoned when they become difficult. They must be completed, or the investment in materials, labor, and time is wasted. The knowledge embedded in these construction projects is largely lost. We can see the results. We can measure the dimensions, analyze the materials, study the architectural plans, and admire the artistic quality of the finished work. But the organizational knowledge that produced those results, the project management techniques, the supply chain procedures, the quality control methods, the personnel management practices, the financial accounting systems, the communication protocols that allowed thousands of workers across multiple sites to coordinate their activities. All of this is gone. It was recorded, if it was recorded at all, on papyrus documents that have not survived. It was held in the institutional memory of the administrative apparatus that managed the projects, an apparatus that functioned continuously for decades under Amenhotep's supervision, but that was eventually disrupted by the political and religious upheavals that followed his death. The artistic achievements of Amenhotep's reign present the same paradox in a different form. The art produced during his reign represents one of the high points of Egyptian artistic achievement, characterized by a combination of technical virtuosity, aesthetic refinement, and stylistic innovation that distinguishes it from the art of any other period. The statuary of Amenhotep III is particularly notable. More than 700 statues of the king have been identified, more than any other pharaoh in Egyptian history, ranging in size from small figurines to the colossal seated figures of the Colossi of Memnon. These statues display a level of craftsmanship that is extraordinary: smooth, polished surfaces, precisely rendered features, subtle modeling of the face and body that suggests portrait, like individuality rather than the idealized anonymity of earlier royal sculpture. The sculptors who produced these works were masters of their craft, artisans who had spent years, perhaps decades, perfecting the techniques of stone carving, surface finishing, and artistic composition that gave Amenhotep's statuary its distinctive character. They worked with some of the hardest and most demanding stones available: quartzite, granodiorite, red granite, and black granite, materials that require specialized tools, techniques, and patience to carve. The knowledge they possessed was not merely artistic, it was technical, involving an understanding of stone properties, tool design, carving sequences, and finishing methods that was as specialized and as demanding as any engineering discipline. And it gets worse, because the artistic knowledge of Amenhotep's reign was not merely lost through the ordinary processes of decay and institutional decline. It was actively disrupted by the revolution that his son Akhenaten imposed on Egyptian civilization within a few years of Amenhotep's death. Akhenaten's religious revolution, which rejected the traditional gods of Egypt in favor of a single deity. The sun disk, called the Aten, was accompanied by a radical transformation in artistic style that repudiated virtually everything the artists of Amenhotep's court had achieved. The idealized, refined, technically perfect statuary of Amenhotep's reign was replaced by a deliberately distorted style characterized by elongated faces, exaggerated features, swollen bellies, and thin limbs. The change was not gradual. It was sudden, imposed from above by royal decree, and it required the artists of the court to unlearn the techniques and aesthetic principles they had spent their careers perfecting and adopt an entirely new approach. The disruption this caused to the artistic tradition is difficult to overstate. The master sculptors who had perfected the art of carving Amenhotep's portraits were suddenly required to produce work in a style that contradicted everything they had been trained to do, some adapted, some were replaced, some may have been reassigned or dismissed. Whatever happened to them individually, the collective effect was the disruption of a craft tradition that had been built up over generations. When the Amarna Revolution ended and the traditional artistic conventions were restored, the restoration was never complete. The post-Amarna art of the late 18th and 19th dynasties drew on the pre-Amarna tradition, but did not fully recover its technical refinement or its aesthetic sophistication. Something had been lost in the disruption, some element of craft knowledge, some accumulation of technical expertise that could not be fully reconstituted once the chain of transmission had been broken. The religious revolution that Akhenaten imposed was, in many ways, the most destructive event in the history of Egyptian institutional knowledge. Akhenaten did not merely change the state religion. He attempted to abolish the entire traditional religious establishment, closing temples, defunding priesthoods, and redirecting the economic resources of the state from the traditional cults to the worship of the Aten, the temples that Amenhotep III had built and maintained, the institutions that housed the houses of life, the scribal schools, the libraries, the archives, the medical facilities, and the administrative apparatus of the traditional religion, were undermined by a pharaoh who saw them as obstacles to his revolutionary vision. The damage to the knowledge infrastructure was catastrophic. The houses of life, which had served as the primary centers of learning and knowledge preservation in Egypt for centuries, depended on the patronage of the traditional temples. When that patronage was withdrawn or reduced, the houses of life could not maintain their operations at previous levels. Scribes who had been trained in the traditional texts, who maintained the libraries and archives, who copied and transmitted the accumulated knowledge of centuries, were reassigned to new institutions serving the Aten cult, or were dismissed, or lost their institutional support. The chain of transmission that had preserved Egyptian knowledge across generations was not cut cleanly. It was frayed, stretched, weakened, and in some cases broken entirely. The scale of the knowledge lost during the Amarna period is impossible to quantify precisely, but the circumstantial evidence is overwhelming. The medical, mathematical, astronomical, literary, and administrative traditions that the houses of life had maintained for centuries show signs of disruption and decline. After the Amarna period, the quality of scribal output deteriorated. The range of texts in circulation narrowed. The institutional memory of the administrative apparatus, the accumulated precedents and procedures that allowed the Egyptian government to function with such efficiency, was damaged. The post-Amarna restoration carried out under Tutankhamun, A and Horemheb attempted to repair the damage, but the restoration was itself evidence that significant damage had occurred. The restoration stela of Tutankhamun describes a country in which the temples were in ruins, the gods were neglected, and prayers went unanswered. Whether this was accurate or merely political propaganda is debated, but the intent is clear. The Amarna period had caused real damage to the institutional fabric of Egyptian civilization, and the pharaohs who followed were engaged in a sustained effort to repair it. The connection between Amenhotep III and the Amarna catastrophe is direct and personal. Akhenaten was Amenhotep's son. The revolution that destroyed so much of Egypt's institutional knowledge was launched by the child of the man who had presided over its golden age. There is some evidence, debated among scholars, that Amenhotep III himself may have initiated some of the religious trends that his son would later radicalize. The cult of the Aten existed before Akhenaten. Amenhotep III used the epithet the dazzling Aten in some of his inscriptions. Some scholars have proposed that Amenhotep shared the throne with his son during the last years of his life, a co-regency that would have given Akhenaten access to royal power while his father was still alive. The co-regency hypothesis is contested, and the evidence is inconclusive. But even without a co-regency, the proximity between Amenhotep's golden age and Akhenaten's revolution raises troubling questions about the relationship between prosperity and vulnerability, between the summit of achievement and the beginning of decline. But here is what makes this truly terrifying. The destruction of Egyptian institutional knowledge during the Amarna period was not an isolated event. It was the most dramatic episode in a longer process of knowledge loss that had begun before Amenhotep's death, and that would continue for centuries after the Amarna period ended. To understand the full scope of what was lost, we need to return to Amenhotep's mortuary temple and examine what it represented as a knowledge institution, not merely as a building. Egyptian mortuary temples were not simply monuments to dead kings. They were functioning religious and economic institutions that employed hundreds of priests, scribes, craftsmen, and support staff. They maintained their own estates, their own herds, their own workshops. They performed daily rituals, weekly ceremonies, and annual festivals that required detailed knowledge of liturgical texts, ritual procedures, astronomical calculations, and theological doctrine. They maintained libraries of religious and scholarly texts. They served as local centers of administration, education, and social welfare. Amenhotep's mortuary temple, as the largest of its kind, would have been the most significant such institution in the Theban necropolis. Its staff would have numbered in the hundreds, perhaps the thousands, if we include the workers who tended its estates and supplied its needs. Its library would have contained copies of the major religious texts of the period, along with administrative records, correspondence, and the other documentary materials required to manage a complex institution. Its ritual calendar would have required precise astronomical knowledge for the timing of festivals, the observation of significant celestial events, and the maintenance of the religious calendar that governed the rhythm of Egyptian life. When the temple was demolished, all of this institutional knowledge was destroyed, along with the physical structure. The priests who served there were dispersed. The rituals they performed ceased. The texts they maintained were lost or scattered. The astronomical observations they recorded were discontinued. The administrative knowledge they had accumulated over generations was dissipated. The temple was not merely a building that was torn down. It was a knowledge institution that was dismantled, a community of practice that was dispersed, a living tradition of scholarship and ritual that was ended. The deification of Amenhotep III during his own lifetime adds another layer to the story of knowledge loss. There is substantial evidence that Amenhotep was worshipped as a living god during the later years of his reign, a status that was unusual even by the standards of Egyptian kingship. Statues of the deified Amenhotep have been found at several sites, including the temple at Soleb in Nubia, where the king is depicted as both the worshipper and the worshipped, making offerings to his own deified form. The theological implications of this self-deification were profound. They represented a significant development in Egyptian religious thought, a step beyond the traditional understanding of the pharaoh as an intermediary between gods and humans toward a more radical identification of the king with divinity itself. Some scholars have suggested that Amenhotep's self-deification influenced his son Akhenaten's later religious innovations, which similarly emphasized the unique divine status of the pharaoh and his exclusive relationship with the supreme deity. If this connection is real, then the theological thinking of Amenhotep's court, the scholarly debates, the priestly discussions, the intellectual ferment that produced these new ideas about kingship and divinity was the crucible in which the Amarna revolution was forged. The knowledge of how these ideas developed, how they were debated, how they were received by the religious establishment, and how they were translated from theoretical theology into practical politics would be invaluable for understanding one of the most important religious transformations in the history of the ancient world. But that knowledge is gone. The theological texts that documented these developments, the priestly commentaries, the scholarly debates, the records of the discussions that must have preceded the extraordinary step of worshiping a living pharaoh as a god. All of this was recorded on papyrus and stored in the archives of the temples and the palace. The papyrus has decayed. The archives have been destroyed. The theological thinking that produced one of the most radical religious innovations in Egyptian history is known to us only through its material expressions, the statues and inscriptions and temple decorations that embody the ideas without explaining them. The wealth that Amenhotep III accumulated had material dimensions that are themselves worth examining as evidence of lost knowledge. The jewelry, furniture, textiles, cosmetics, and other luxury goods produced during his reign were among the finest ever created in the ancient world. The goldsmiths, silversmiths, glassmakers, faience producers, textile weavers, and other craftsmen who produced these goods worked at the highest level of their respective traditions, using techniques that had been refined over centuries and that required years of apprenticeship to master. The glass working industry of 18th dynasty Egypt, which had its origins in the earliest period of Egyptian glass production and reached new heights during Amenhotep's reign, provides a specific example. Egyptian glassmakers of this period produced vessels, jewelry, and decorative objects of extraordinary beauty and technical sophistication. They worked with a range of colored glasses, achieving vivid blues, greens, yellows, and reds through the precise addition of mineral colorants, including cobalt compounds for blue, copper compounds for green, antimonate of lead for yellow, and iron oxide for red. The production of these colored glasses required detailed knowledge of the chemical properties of the raw materials, the temperature profiles of the furnaces, and the specific techniques of forming, decorating, and annealing the finished objects. The faience industry was equally sophisticated. Egyptian faience, a glazed, non-clay ceramic material, was produced in enormous quantities during Amenhotep's reign, used for everything from small amulets and beads to large-scale architectural decorations. The production of faience required knowledge of the specific composition of the quartz paste body, the formulation of the alkaline glaze, and the firing conditions required to achieve the desired color and surface quality. Different colors were produced by different chemical formulations: copper compounds for the characteristic Egyptian blue, cobalt for deep blue, manganese for violet, iron for yellow and brown. The recipes for these colors, the specific proportions of raw materials, the precise firing temperatures, and the techniques for applying and controlling the glaze were craft secrets held by the families and workshops that produced the material. When the economic disruptions that followed Amenhotep's death reduced the demand for luxury goods, when the Amarna Revolution redirected economic resources away from the traditional craft centers, when the political instability of the late 18th dynasty disrupted the supply chains and patronage networks that sustained the craft workshops, many of these specialized skills were lost or degraded. The post-Amarna period saw a decline in the quality and variety of Egyptian luxury production that suggests a genuine loss of craft knowledge, not merely a reduction in economic demand, but an actual deterioration in the technical capability of the surviving workshops. The tomb of Yuya and Thuya, Amenhotep's in-laws, provides a poignant illustration of the level of craftsmanship that was being produced during his reign. The burial equipment found in their tomb, including gilded wooden furniture, elaborately decorated coffins, and finely worked personal objects, displays a level of technical refinement that is exceptional even by the high standards of 18th dynasty craftsmanship. The woodworking shows a mastery of joinery, veneer application, and gilding technique that required years of specialized training. The textile fragments, including linen garments of extraordinary fineness, demonstrate a weaving tradition of remarkable sophistication. Each of these crafts represented a body of knowledge that was maintained by specific communities of practitioners and transmitted through specific chains of apprenticeship and mentorship. The empire that Amenhotep had managed so skillfully was already showing signs of strain. The vassal states in the Levant were growing restive. The Hittite Empire was expanding its influence at Egypt's expense. The military establishment, which had not been tested by a major campaign during Amenhotep's entire reign, was losing the combat readiness that only active service can maintain. The Golden Age was not merely a peak. It was a precipice, and the fall, when it came, was as swift as it was devastating. The story of Amenhotep III's lost world gains depth when we place it alongside other examples of knowledge lost at the height of civilizational achievement. The pattern is consistent and unsettling. Civilizations do not lose their knowledge during periods of weakness and decline. They begin losing it during periods of strength and prosperity, when the very success of the system breeds the complacency and institutional rigidity that will eventually destroy it. Consider the fate of the mortuary temple itself, the vast structure that once stood behind the colossi of Memnon. This was not merely a temple. It was a statement of civilizational confidence, a building so large and so richly decorated that it proclaimed in every dimension and every detail the absolute supremacy of Amenhotep III and the civilization he represented. The temple was built from the finest materials available: sandstone and quartzite for the structural elements, alabaster for the pavements, gold for the door fittings, and hundreds of statues in granite, quartzite, and other hard stones to line the courts and corridors. The construction required the quarrying, transport, and assembly of millions of tons of stone, coordinated by an administrative apparatus that must have rivaled the bureaucracy of a modern construction company. And yet, this extraordinary structure, built to endure for eternity, began to be dismantled within a few centuries of its completion. The 19th dynasty pharaoh Merneptah, who ruled approximately 130 years after Amenhotep III, used stones from the mortuary temple in the construction of his own temple nearby. The practice continued under subsequent pharaohs, who found in the abandoned temple a convenient quarry of pre-cut, high-quality stone. By the time the temple was fully demolished, its stones had been scattered across multiple construction sites, its statues broken or buried, and its decorations destroyed. The building that had been designed to preserve the memory of Amenhotep III for eternity was consumed by the very civilization it had been built to glorify. The irony is specific and instructive. The mortuary temple was destroyed not by foreign invaders, not by natural disaster, not by the slow erosion of wind and sand. It was destroyed by Egyptians, by the successors of the man who built it, by people who shared his language, his religion, his cultural traditions, and his fundamental assumptions about the world. They destroyed it not out of malice, but out of convenience. They needed stone. The temple provided stone. The fact that the stone had been quarried, cut, shaped, transported, and inscribed at enormous expense by their predecessors was irrelevant. The practical need of the present outweighed the memorial value of the past. This pattern of reuse and destruction is not unique to Egypt. It is a universal feature of the human relationship with the built environment. The Colosseum in Rome was used as a quarry for building stone throughout the medieval period. Its travertine blocks carted away to construct churches, palaces, and fortifications. The Library of Alexandria, whatever its precise history, was gradually diminished over centuries by a combination of accidental fires, political upheaval, and institutional neglect. Its collections dispersed and destroyed long before the final catastrophe, whenever that might have been. The great monastic libraries of medieval Europe were dissolved during the Reformation, their manuscripts scattered, sold, or destroyed by people who valued the religious Reformation more than the bibliographic heritage of the institutions they were dismantling. But the loss of Amenhotep's mortuary temple is particularly significant because of what the temple represented. It was not merely a building. It was a knowledge repository, a structure whose walls were covered with texts and images that documented the religious beliefs, the ritual practices, the historical narratives, and the artistic conventions of Amenhotep's reign. The scenes carved on its walls depicted the king in communion with the gods, performing rituals, receiving tribute from foreign lands, celebrating festivals, and presiding over the ceremonies that maintained the cosmic order. These scenes were not merely decorative. They were instructional. They recorded specific ritual sequences, specific prayers, specific offerings, and specific theological concepts that were essential to the functioning of the religious system that the temple served. When the temple was demolished, this information was destroyed along with the stone on which it was carved. The commemorative scarabs of Amenhotep III provide a fascinating counterpoint to the loss of his mortuary temple because they are examples of a form of royal communication that, by virtue of its small size and wide distribution, has survived in far greater numbers than the monumental inscriptions. Amenhotep issued at least 5 series of commemorative scarabs during his reign, each one recording a specific event or achievement. The marriage scarabs commemorate his marriage to Queen Tai, noting her parents' names, Yuya and Thuya, and establishing her status as great royal wife. The lion hunt scarabs record that Amenhotep killed 102 lions during the first 10 years of his reign. The wild bull hunt scarabs commemorate a single hunt in which the king captured 96 wild bulls. The lake scarabs record the construction of an artificial lake for Queen Tai at the Malkata Palace complex. And the Gilukepa scarabs commemorate the arrival of a Mitannian princess, Gilukepa, as a bride for the Egyptian king, accompanied by a retinue of 317 ladies. These scarabs are remarkable documents. They are, in effect, press releases, official communications, designed to broadcast the achievements of the king to a wide audience. They were distributed throughout Egypt and the empire, ensuring that the events they commemorated would be known not only in the capital, but in the provinces and the vassal states. The fact that hundreds of these scarabs have survived, scattered across collections worldwide, is a consequence of their small size, their durability, and their wide distribution. Unlike the mortuary temple, which was a single localized structure that could be quarried for stone, the scarabs were numerous, portable, and relatively worthless as raw material. They survived because they were too small and too numerous to be worth destroying. But the information they contain, while valuable, is frustratingly limited. They tell us that Amenhotep married Tai. They do not tell us why a pharaoh chose to marry the daughter of a provincial official rather than a princess of royal blood. They tell us that Amenhotep hunted lions. They do not tell us the ceremonial, religious, or political significance of the royal hunt in 18th dynasty Egypt. They tell us that Amenhotep built a lake for his queen. They do not tell us the engineering methods used, the labor force employed, or the administrative procedures followed. They are headlines without articles, announcements without context, facts without meaning. The meaning was embedded in the institutional knowledge of the people who created and distributed the scarabs. Knowledge that has been lost along with everything else. The loss of the knowledge that sustained Amenhotep's golden age can be compared, in its mechanisms and its consequences, with several other well-documented cases of knowledge loss in the ancient world. Roman concrete provides one of the most striking parallels. The Romans developed a building material of extraordinary durability that has outlasted any modern equivalent. The Pantheon's unreinforced concrete dome, spanning more than 43 meters, has stood for nearly 2 millennia. Roman marine concrete, used in harbor construction, has grown stronger over the centuries through a self-healing process involving the crystallization of aluminum tobermorite. Modern concrete begins to degrade within decades. The formula for Roman concrete was not secret. It was common knowledge throughout the Roman building industry, and it was lost when the Roman building industry collapsed along with the economic and institutional infrastructure that sustained it. Damascus steel represents another peak of ancient craftsmanship that was lost when the conditions that supported it changed. The distinctive Wootz steel of the medieval Middle East and South Asia, characterized by its watered pattern and exceptional mechanical properties, was the product of a specific combination of raw materials, processing techniques, and craft knowledge that had been accumulated over centuries of practice. When the specific ore sources were depleted and the traditional craft lineages were disrupted, the knowledge was lost. Modern metallurgists have identified the nanostructures, carbon nanotubes, and cementite nanowires that give Damascus steel its distinctive properties, but consistent reproduction of the original material remains elusive. Greek fire, the incendiary weapon that defended the Byzantine Empire against Arab naval attacks for centuries, was lost when the small circle of specialists who knew its formula was disrupted by the political upheavals that accompanied the empire's decline. The formula was a state secret known to only a handful of people at any given time. When those people died without passing their knowledge to successors, the formula vanished. Modern researchers have proposed numerous candidates for the active ingredient, but have not achieved a definitive identification. The Antikythera mechanism, the extraordinary mechanical calculator discovered in a Roman-era shipwreck, demonstrates that entire traditions of mechanical engineering can exist, and then vanish without leaving any trace in the historical record. The mechanism is too sophisticated to be a one-off invention. It must be the product of a tradition. But the earlier devices in that tradition, the prototypes and predecessors that must have existed, have never been found. They were made of bronze, which is too valuable to leave unrecycled. The Antikythera mechanism survived only because it sank with a ship and was sealed at the bottom of the sea for 2,000 years. Without that accidental preservation, we would have no evidence that the tradition existed at all. The numbers are striking when we consider these losses collectively. Each lost technology represents a peak of human achievement in a specific domain: construction, metallurgy, military chemistry, mechanical engineering. Each was the product of generations of accumulated expertise. Each was lost when the conditions that sustained it, the institutional support, the material supply chains, the craft lineages, the economic incentives, were disrupted, and each loss is permanent. Modern science can analyze the products of these traditions but cannot fully recover the original knowledge, because that knowledge was tacit, embedded in the hands and instincts of practitioners who learned their craft through years of apprenticeship and practice. The connection to Amenhotep's Egypt is direct. The wealth, the art, the diplomacy, the administration, the religious knowledge, the architectural expertise that characterized his reign were all products of traditions that had been built up over centuries. They were maintained by communities of practitioners who transmitted their knowledge from generation to generation through apprenticeship, mentorship, and institutional practice. When those communities were disrupted by the Amarna Revolution, by economic decline, by political upheaval, by the simple passage of time, the knowledge they held began to degrade. And the degradation, once it began, was cumulative, self-reinforcing, and ultimately irreversible. Let that sink in. The wealthiest civilization in the ancient world could not buy permanence for its knowledge. The gold that Tushratta envied, the gold that was as common as dust in Egypt, could not preserve the administrative expertise, the diplomatic skill, the artistic mastery, the religious understanding that made Egypt great. Gold could build temples. It could not maintain the institutions that gave those temples meaning. Gold could purchase alliances. It could not preserve the diplomatic knowledge that made those alliances function. Gold could fund the production of art. It could not prevent the disruption of the artistic tradition that made the art possible. The lesson is stark. Wealth is not a substitute for wisdom. Resources are not a substitute for knowledge. Material abundance is not protection against intellectual loss. The undeciphered scripts of the ancient world provide yet another dimension to this picture of civilizational knowledge loss. Linear A, the writing system of the Minoan civilization, has resisted decipherment, despite a century of scholarly effort. The Indus Valley script of the Harappan civilization, inscribed on more than 4,000 seals and other objects, remains unreadable. If these scripts conceal administrative records, religious texts, literary works, or historical narratives, that knowledge is locked behind a barrier that may never be breached. The Voynich manuscript, a mysterious illustrated codex from the 15th century, written in an unknown script and filled with images of unidentifiable plants and enigmatic diagrams, has defeated every attempt at decipherment since its rediscovery in 1912. Each of these represents a door that cannot be opened, a voice that cannot be heard, a silence that may be permanent. The loss of classical literature provides another dimension of comparison that illuminates the scale of what has been lost from Amenhotep's Egypt. Of the literary output of ancient Greece and Rome, we possess only a small fraction. Aeschylus wrote approximately 70 to 90 plays. 7 survive. Sophocles wrote more than 127 survive. Euripides wrote approximately 92, 18 survive. The comic poet Menander, considered one of the greatest writers of the ancient world, was known for centuries only from fragments and quotations, until portions of his plays were recovered from papyri in Egypt. The lyric poet Sappho, whom Plato called the 10th Muse, is known from a single complete poem and scattered fragments that sometimes consist of a few words on a damaged scrap of papyrus. The works that survive, the tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, the comedies of Aristophanes, the histories of Herodotus and Thucydides, the philosophies of Plato and Aristotle, magnificent as they are, represent the survivors of a selection process driven as much by accident and the tastes of medieval copyists as by any objective measure of quality or importance. The loss rate for ancient literature has been estimated at between 95 and 99%. If this figure is accurate, and it is consistent with the available evidence, then for every work of ancient literature that survives, between 19 and 99 works have been lost. The corpus of surviving Greek and Roman literature, which fills many thousands of modern printed volumes and constitutes one of the great intellectual achievements of Western civilization, is no more than a fraction of what once existed. The missing works include philosophical treatises, scientific texts, historical narratives, mathematical proofs, medical manuals, engineering descriptions, and literary works of every genre, all destroyed by the combination of material decay, political upheaval, religious change, and institutional collapse that has stripped the ancient world of most of its documentary heritage. If the loss rate for Greco-Roman literature is 95 to 99%, the loss rate for Egyptian literature is almost certainly higher, because Egyptian texts were written on papyrus, which is more perishable than parchment, and because the institutional disruptions that affected Egypt, including the Amarna Revolution, the Hyksos invasion, the Persian conquest, the Macedonian conquest, and the conversion to Christianity, were more severe and more sustained than those that affected the classical world. The total surviving corpus of Egyptian literary texts, collected from tombs, temples, and rubbish heaps across the Nile Valley, amounts to a few thousand documents, many of them fragmentary or damaged. This corpus represents, at best, a tiny fraction of 1% of the literary output of a civilization that flourished for more than 3,000 years. The implications for our understanding of Amenhotep's Egypt are stark. We are trying to reconstruct the intellectual, cultural, and administrative life of the wealthiest and most sophisticated civilization in the ancient world, using a sample that is vanishingly small, hopelessly biased, and irreparably damaged. The picture we construct from this sample may be broadly accurate in its outlines, but it is certainly incomplete in its details, and it may be fundamentally distorted by the absence of evidence that we do not know we are missing. The things we do not know about Amenhotep's Egypt are not merely gaps in a largely complete picture. They may be the most important parts of the picture, the parts that would change our understanding of the whole if they were ever recovered. The destruction of the Library of Alexandria, whatever its precise historical circumstances, has become the universal symbol of knowledge loss in the popular imagination. The library, founded by the Ptolemaic pharaohs in the 3rd century before the Common Era, is said to have contained hundreds of thousands of papyrus scrolls representing the accumulated literary and scientific knowledge of the ancient world. Its destruction, whether by fire during Julius Caesar's siege in 48 before the Common Era, by the decree of the Roman Emperor Theodosius in the late 4th century, by the Arab conquest in the 7th century, or most likely by a combination of events spread across several centuries, has been mourned by scholars and lamented by the general public as the greatest single act of cultural destruction in human history. But the loss of the Library of Alexandria, catastrophic as it was, may be less significant than the less dramatic, less visible, less commemorated losses that preceded it by centuries. The libraries and archives of pharaonic Egypt, the collections maintained by the houses of life at Heliopolis, Memphis, Thebes, and dozens of other sites across the Nile Valley, contained the accumulated knowledge of a civilization that was already ancient when the Library of Alexandria was founded. These collections predated the Library of Alexandria by more than 2,000 years, They contain texts in a language and script that the Ptolemaic scholars could no longer read without difficulty. They represented a tradition of learning that was, in many respects, more ancient and more profound than the Hellenistic scholarship that the Library of Alexandria would later represent. And they are gone. Not destroyed in a single dramatic conflagration that has entered popular mythology. Destroyed gradually, incrementally, through the accumulation of small losses over centuries. The decay of papyrus, the neglect of archives, the disruption of institutions, the loss of trained scribes, the defunding of temples, the conversion to new religions, the adoption of new languages and scripts. The loss of the pharaonic libraries was not a single event. It was a process, a slow bleeding of knowledge that began centuries before the Library of Alexandria was founded, and that continued for centuries after it was destroyed. And because it was a process rather than an event, it has never captured the popular imagination the way the burning of Alexandria has. It has no dramatic narrative, no villain, no moment of catastrophe that can be pointed to and mourned. It is simply a silence, a vast and pervasive silence that stretches from the beginning of Egyptian civilization to its end, broken only by the scattered fragments that accident and favorable conditions have preserved. The connection between this broader pattern of loss and the specific achievements of Amenhotep III becomes clearer when we consider what specific types of knowledge were most vulnerable to loss. Administrative knowledge, the detailed procedural expertise required to manage a complex government, is particularly perishable because it is rarely considered important enough to preserve for its own sake. Tax collection procedures, personnel management protocols, supply chain logistics, judicial processes, and the many other bureaucratic routines that keep a government functioning are boring. They do not inspire the kind of reverence that motivates the careful copying and preservation of religious texts or literary masterpieces. They are the mundane mechanics of civilization, and they are precisely the knowledge that is most likely to be lost when the institutions that practice them are disrupted. Amenhotep III's government was, by all available evidence, one of the most effective administrative machines in the ancient world. It managed an empire of several million people across thousands of kilometers of territory. It coordinated military operations, diplomatic negotiations, construction projects, religious festivals, and economic activity on a continental scale. It collected taxes, maintained censuses, adjudicated disputes, and distributed resources with an efficiency that sustained Egyptian prosperity for decades. The knowledge embedded in this administrative machine, the procedures, the precedents, the institutional habits, the accumulated wisdom of generations of experienced officials, was the foundation on which everything else rested. Without effective administration, the temples could not function, the military could not operate, the diplomacy could not be conducted, the construction projects could not be completed. The administrative knowledge was the connective tissue that held the entire civilization together, and it was the first thing to be lost when the system was disrupted. The administrative records were written on papyrus. The administrative expertise was held by people. The administrative institutions were dependent on continuous funding and staffing. When any of these elements was interrupted, when the papyrus decayed, when the people died or were reassigned, when the institutions lost their funding or their organizational coherence, the administrative knowledge began to evaporate, silently, invisibly, without anyone noticing until the system that depended on it began to malfunction. The Maya codices represent perhaps the most devastating example of deliberate knowledge destruction in the history of the Americas. The Maya civilization produced thousands of bark, paper books containing astronomical observations, calendar calculations, historical narratives, religious rituals, and medical knowledge accumulated over more than 2 millennia. Spanish missionaries, viewing these codices as instruments of pagan idolatry, systematically gathered and burned them. Bishop Diego de Landa supervised mass burnings in 1562. Of the thousands of codices that once existed, only 4 survive, 4 books from an entire civilization's literary output. The loss is incalculable. Each of these examples reinforces the same fundamental principle. Human knowledge is not permanent, not cumulative, not inherently progressive. It is a living thing that requires active maintenance, institutional support, and continuous investment. When any of these conditions fail, knowledge begins to die, and when knowledge dies, it dies completely. There is no half-knowledge, no ghost of a forgotten formula. There is only presence and absence, knowing and not knowing. The transition between the two can happen with devastating speed, as the Amarna Revolution demonstrated, or with glacial slowness, as the decline of Roman concrete illustrates. But the result is the same, a permanent subtraction from the sum of human understanding that can never be reversed. The deeper truth about Amenhotep III and his golden age is not merely that knowledge was lost. It is that the loss was built into the very structure of the success. The wealth, the power, the cultural achievement that characterized his reign contained within themselves the seeds of their own dissolution. This is not a moral judgment. It is a structural observation about the nature of complex civilizations and the knowledge systems that sustain them. The paradox works as follows. A civilization achieves a high level of complexity. This complexity requires specialized knowledge distributed across multiple domains: military, administrative, diplomatic, religious, artistic, medical, architectural, agricultural, and more. Each domain develops its own community of practitioners, its own traditions of training, its own institutional structures, its own chains of transmission from master to apprentice. The system works because all of these domains are interconnected, each one supporting and being supported by every other. The military protects the state, which funds the temples, which maintain the houses of life, which train the scribes, which administer the economy, which generates the wealth, which funds the military. The circle is complete. The system is stable. The civilization prospers. But the very stability of the system creates a vulnerability. When things are going well, when the system is functioning smoothly, when the wealth is flowing, and the borders are secure, and the institutions are operating as designed, there is a natural tendency to reduce investment in the maintenance of the system itself. Training programs are cut because the current generation of practitioners seems adequate. Archives are neglected because there is no immediate need for the knowledge they contain. Institutional redundancies are eliminated because they seem wasteful. Innovation slows because the existing methods appear to be working. The system is not being damaged. It is being optimized, made more efficient by eliminating what appears to be unnecessary overhead. But what appears to be unnecessary overhead is actually the margin of safety, the redundancy, the flexibility that allows the system to absorb shocks and adapt to changing conditions. Amenhotep III's reign exhibits precisely this pattern. His Egypt was so wealthy, so powerful, so thoroughly dominant in the ancient world that there was no obvious need for the kind of continuous military vigilance that had characterized the reigns of his predecessors. Thutmose III had conducted 17 military campaigns in 20 years. Amenhotep II had conducted at least 3 major campaigns. Thutmose IV had conducted at least 1. Amenhotep III, as far as we can tell from the surviving evidence, conducted none, not one major military campaign in 38 years. The empire was maintained through diplomacy, economic pressure, and the residual prestige of earlier military achievements. The army was not disbanded, it continued to exist, but it was not tested, not hardened, not given the opportunity to develop and maintain the combat skills and institutional habits that only active service can provide. The consequences of this military inactivity became apparent within a generation of Amenhotep's death. The Amarna letters from the reign of Akhenaten reveal an empire in crisis with vassal kings in the Levant sending increasingly desperate appeals for military assistance that was not forthcoming. The Hittite Empire, which had been a minor concern during Amenhotep's reign, was expanding aggressively into territory that Egypt considered its sphere of influence. The military machine that Thutmose III had built, The force that had crushed the coalition at Megiddo and crossed the Euphrates to defeat Mitanni was no longer capable of responding effectively to these challenges. The institutional knowledge that had made the Egyptian army the most effective fighting force in the world had degraded through decades of disuse. This is not science fiction. This is the ordinary process by which institutional knowledge atrophies when it is not actively maintained and exercised. Modern military analysts call it capability fade. The gradual loss of combat readiness that occurs when a military force goes extended periods without operational deployment. The phenomenon has been observed in every modern military that has experienced prolonged periods of peace. Skills rust, procedures become pro forma, rather than substantive institutional memory fades as experienced personnel retire, and their replacements lack the practical experience that can only be gained through active operations. The Egyptian military of Amenhotep's late reign was experiencing exactly this process, a process that was invisible to contemporaries because it did not manifest as a dramatic failure, but as a subtle, incremental decline in the quality of military expertise that was apparent only in retrospect when the system was finally tested and found wanting. The diplomatic system was similarly vulnerable. Amenhotep III was a master diplomat, a man who maintained Egypt's international position through a combination of personal charisma, strategic generosity, and the accumulated prestige of his dynasty. His diplomatic relationships were, to a large extent, personal relationships, connections between individual rulers who knew and trusted each other, who had exchanged gifts and courtesies, who had married each other's daughters, and who had a personal stake in maintaining the system that served their mutual interests. When Amenhotep died, these personal relationships died with him. His son Akhenaten, consumed by his religious revolution, appears to have neglected the diplomatic correspondence that his father had maintained with such care. The Amarna letters from Akhenaten's reign show a pharaoh who was either uninterested in or incapable of managing the complex web of international relationships that his father had sustained. The vassals were ignored, the allies were alienated, the rivals were emboldened. The diplomatic system that had maintained Egyptian influence across the Near East for decades unraveled within a few years. The religious knowledge that Amenhotep had patronized and that the temple institutions had maintained for centuries was, as we have discussed, severely damaged by the Amarna revolution. But the damage went deeper than the disruption of specific institutions. The revolution damaged something more fundamental: the trust between the pharaoh and the religious establishment, the implicit social contract that governed the relationship between royal power and priestly authority in Egyptian civilization. For centuries, the pharaohs had supported the temples, and the temples had legitimized the pharaohs, each side contributing something the other needed. The Amarna revolution shattered this arrangement. The pharaoh turned against the temples. The temples, once the revolution was reversed, turned against the memory of the pharaoh who had attacked them. The result was a permanent scar in the relationship between state and priesthood that would shape Egyptian politics for centuries. Let that sink in. The golden age of Amenhotep III, the wealthiest, most powerful, most culturally productive period in Egyptian history, was also the period that set the stage for the most devastating institutional crisis in Egyptian history. The success bred the complacency, the peace bred the military decline. The wealth bred the overconfidence. The religious experimentation of the father laid the groundwork for the revolution of the son. The golden age was not merely a peak from which the decline was a descent. It was the cause of the decline, the necessary precondition, the set of circumstances without which the Amarna catastrophe could not have occurred. This is the deeper truth. Wealth does not protect. Power does not preserve. Success does not endure. The very conditions that produce a golden age are the conditions that make the golden age unsustainable. The wealth that allows a civilization to reduce its military investment makes it vulnerable to military threats. The stability that allows a civilization to neglect its institutional maintenance makes it vulnerable to institutional failure. The confidence that a golden age inspires makes the civilization blind to the signs of decline that are accumulating beneath the glittering surface. The pattern is not unique to Egypt. It recurs throughout human history, with a regularity that suggests it is structural rather than accidental. The Roman Empire at its height, during the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, was the wealthiest and most powerful civilization in the Western world. Its infrastructure was extraordinary. Roads, aqueducts, baths, amphitheaters, harbors, and fortifications that were not matched in quality for more than 1,000 years after the fall of the Western Empire. And yet the very wealth and stability that characterized the Roman peak was accompanied by the beginnings of the decline. The substitution of foreign mercenaries for citizen soldiers, the concentration of wealth in the hands of a small elite, the neglect of infrastructure maintenance, the erosion of civic institutions, and the gradual loss of the administrative and military knowledge that had built the empire in the first place. The Islamic Golden Age, stretching from roughly the 8th to the 14th century of the Common Era, produced some of the most significant advances in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, chemistry, philosophy, and literature in the history of civilization. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad, the libraries of Cordoba and Cairo, the observatories of Samarkand and Isfahan, were centers of learning that preserved and extended the intellectual heritage of the ancient world during a period when much of that heritage was being lost in Europe. And yet, this extraordinary tradition of learning was vulnerable to the same forces that had destroyed the knowledge traditions of earlier civilizations: political upheaval, military conquest, religious conservatism, and the disruption of the institutional structures that supported scholarly activity. The Mongol destruction of Baghdad in 1258, which reportedly turned the waters of the Tigris black with the ink of the books thrown into the river, was the most dramatic episode in a longer process of decline that had been underway for decades. The deeper truth, then, is not merely that knowledge is fragile. It is that knowledge is most fragile precisely when it appears most secure. The Golden Age, the period of maximum wealth, maximum power, maximum cultural achievement, is also the period of maximum vulnerability, because it is the period when the conditions that protect knowledge, active maintenance, institutional investment, continuous training, redundancy, flexibility, are most likely to be neglected. The Golden Age feels permanent. It feels inevitable. It feels as though the achievements it represents will endure forever, because the resources that produce them are still abundant, and the institutions that support them are still functioning. But the feeling is an illusion. The resources can be depleted. The institutions can be disrupted. The knowledge can be lost, and it can be lost far more quickly than anyone, living in the comfort and security of the Golden Age, would believe possible. Amenhotep III sat at the summit of the ancient world and surveyed a civilization that seemed, to every appearance, invincible. His treasury was full, his borders were secure, his diplomats were respected, his artists were producing masterworks, his temples were magnificent, his people were prosperous. Everything he could see, everything he could measure, everything his advisors could report, told him that Egypt was at the peak of its power, and that the peak would endure indefinitely. Within 2 generations, the empire was crumbling. Within 3, the dynasty was extinct. Within 5, the knowledge that had sustained the Golden Age was irrecoverably degraded. The gold remained, buried in tombs and scattered across the desert. The temples remained, carved in stone that would outlast the civilization that built them. But the living knowledge, the institutional wisdom, the administrative expertise, the diplomatic skill, the artistic mastery, the religious understanding that had animated those temples and justified that gold and sustained that civilization at its extraordinary peak, was gone, spent, dissipated, lost. The Late Bronze Age collapse, the catastrophic series of events around 1200 before the Common Era that destroyed or severely damaged virtually every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean, was in a sense the ultimate consequence of the processes that had begun during Amenhotep's Golden Age. The international system that Amenhotep had managed, the web of diplomatic relationships, trade networks, and military alliances that maintained peace and prosperity across the Near East, had been gradually weakening since his death. The Amarna revolution had damaged Egypt's ability to uphold its end of the system. The Hittite expansion had destabilized the balance of power. When the system finally collapsed, under the combined pressures of invasions by the Sea Peoples, internal rebellions, economic disruption, and possibly environmental change, the result was catastrophic. Entire civilizations disappeared. The Hittite Empire ceased to exist. The Mycenaean palace culture was destroyed, and Greece entered a period of cultural regression lasting centuries, a period so marked by the loss of literacy that it is known as the Greek Dark Ages. Egypt survived, but in diminished form. Its empire lost, its wealth depleted, its institutions weakened. The knowledge lost during the Late Bronze Age collapse was immense. Scribes of the Mycenaean palaces ceased to write. Literacy disappeared from the Aegean for centuries. Trade networks that had connected the Mediterranean in a single economic system were broken. Craft traditions that had produced some of the finest objects of the Bronze Age were interrupted. The world that emerged from the collapse was a poorer, simpler, and less connected world than the one Amenhotep had presided over at its peak. The gold was as common as dust, and the knowledge turned out to be as fragile as papyrus. Something is wrong with our assumptions about how civilizations rise and fall. We tend to imagine the process as a dramatic narrative, a story with clear causes and clear effects, with identifiable villains and avoidable mistakes. The Amarna revolution destroyed the knowledge. The Late Bronze Age collapse finished the job. If only Akhenaten had not been so radical. If only the Sea Peoples had not invaded. If only the pharaohs who followed had been more competent. But this narrative of blame and causation misses the deeper point. The knowledge was not destroyed by a single event or a single person. It was eroded by a process. A slow, grinding, relentless process that began during the Golden Age itself, and that continued with occasional interruptions and partial reversals for centuries after the Golden Age ended. The process operates through what modern scholars of institutional decline call knowledge hemorrhage, the gradual, often imperceptible loss of institutional capability that occurs when experienced practitioners leave an organization and are replaced by less experienced successors, or when established procedures are modified or abandoned in the name of efficiency, or when the training systems that produce new practitioners are degraded by budget cuts, curricular changes, or shifting priorities. Knowledge hemorrhage is almost invisible to the people experiencing it, because the system continues to function, at least superficially, even as its underlying capability degrades. The forms are maintained, the procedures are followed. The institutions continue to operate, but the quality of the output declines, slowly, incrementally, in ways that are difficult to measure and easy to rationalize. And by the time the decline becomes obvious, by the time the system fails visibly and catastrophically, the accumulated loss is so great that recovery is extremely difficult, and in some cases impossible. This is precisely what happened to the knowledge systems of Amenhotep's Egypt. The temples continued to function after the Amarna period. The scribes continued to write, the administrators continued to administer, the artists continued to produce, but the quality and range of their output declined, subtly at first, then more markedly as the accumulated expertise of the pre-Amarna tradition was diluted by the disruptions of the revolution and its aftermath. The 19th dynasty, which succeeded the 18th, produced impressive achievements of its own, including the massive building projects of Ramesses II and the military campaigns that led to the Battle of Kadesh. But these achievements, impressive as they were, did not match the integrated sophistication of Amenhotep's Golden Age, the seamless combination of military power, diplomatic skill, administrative efficiency, artistic excellence, and cultural confidence that had characterized the civilization at its peak. Something had been lost in the transition. Not everything, not catastrophically, but enough to change the character of the civilization, to narrow its range, to reduce its flexibility, to make it less than it had been. The paradox of the Golden Age, the discovery that the peak of civilizational achievement is also the moment of greatest vulnerability is perhaps the most unsettling insight that the study of ancient history can offer to the modern world. It challenges our deepest assumptions about the nature of progress and the meaning of success. We tend to think of civilizational decline as something that happens to weak societies, to societies that have failed in some fundamental way, that lack the resources, the intelligence, the will, or the moral fiber to sustain themselves. The example of Amenhotep's Egypt suggests otherwise. Egypt at its peak was not weak. It was the strongest civilization in the world. It did not lack resources. It had more resources than any other society on earth. It did not lack intelligence. Its administrative, diplomatic, and artistic achievements demonstrate a level of intellectual capability that has rarely been surpassed. It did not lack will. The building program of Amenhotep III, the largest construction effort since the Old Kingdom, was an expression of civilizational ambition so vast that it took the rest of Egyptian history to complete, or rather, to demolish. The problem was not weakness. The problem was a specific kind of strength. A strength so great that it masked the vulnerabilities it was creating. The wealth that allowed Egypt to maintain its empire without fighting made the military less capable. The diplomatic success that kept the peace made the diplomats complacent. The cultural confidence that produced masterworks of art and architecture made the intellectual establishment resistant to change. The religious stability that sustained the temple system made the priestly establishment vulnerable to a revolutionary challenge from within. Each strength created a corresponding weakness. Each success sowed the seeds of a future failure. Modern historians and political scientists have given this pattern various names. Some call it the paradox of prosperity. Others call it imperial overstretch. Still others describe it as the tragedy of complacency. But the underlying dynamic is always the same. A system achieves a high level of performance. The high performance creates a sense of security. The sense of security reduces the investment in the systems that maintain performance. The reduced investment causes performance to degrade. The degradation is initially invisible, masked by the accumulated reserves that the system built up during its period of peak performance. By the time the degradation becomes visible, it has progressed too far to be easily reversed. The reserves have been consumed. The expertise has been lost. The institutions have been hollowed out. And the golden age, which seems so permanent, so inevitable, so much the natural order of things, is revealed to have been a temporary state, a brief flowering that was sustained by conditions that could not be maintained indefinitely. The application of this pattern to our own civilization is obvious and uncomfortable. We live in a world that is, by every material measure, at the peak of its performance. Our economic output, our technological capability, our medical knowledge, our communications infrastructure, our military power, all of these are at levels that would have been unimaginable even a century ago. And yet the vulnerabilities that the pattern predicts are clearly present. Our military capabilities, while formidable, depend on technological systems of such complexity that a significant disruption of the supply chains that produce and maintain them could render them inoperative within months. Our medical knowledge, while extraordinary, depends on research institutions, pharmaceutical companies, and healthcare systems that require continuous funding and staffing to function. Our agricultural system, which feeds billions of people, depends on supply chains of such length and complexity that a disruption at any point could have cascading effects across the entire system. The knowledge that sustains all of these systems is concentrated in specialized communities that are far smaller than the general population that depends on their expertise. The number of people who truly understand the design and operation of a modern semiconductor fabrication plant, or a nuclear power station, or a telecommunications satellite, or a vaccine production facility, is measured in thousands or tens of thousands out of a global population of billions. These specialists are the modern equivalents of the Egyptian scribes and priests, The small, highly trained communities of practitioners who held the knowledge that sustained the civilization. If those communities were disrupted, if the training institutions that produced them were damaged, if the economic systems that fund them were interrupted, the knowledge they hold could be lost far more quickly than most people believe possible. NASA's experience with the Saturn V rocket provides a specific and cautionary example. The Saturn V, which carried human beings to the moon, was one of the most complex machines ever built. When the Apollo program ended and production was terminated, engineers who later considered reviving the design found that significant elements of the manufacturing knowledge had been lost. Despite the survival of extensive documentation, the blueprints existed. The specifications were on file, but the tacit knowledge of the engineers who had designed and built the rocket, the thousands of small decisions about materials, tolerances, assembly procedures, and testing protocols that had been made during the manufacturing process but never formally recorded, was gone. Within a single generation, the capability to reproduce the most powerful rocket ever launched had been significantly degraded. The parallel with Amenhotep's Egypt is precise. The annals of Thutmose III are still carved on the walls of Karnak. The statues of Amenhotep III still stand in museums around the world. The Amarna letters are still available in multiple translations. The physical records survive, but the knowledge that produced the achievements those records document, the living, practicing institutional knowledge that transformed stone into temples and gold, into diplomacy and papyrus, into governance, is as dead as the men who held it. The colossi of Memnon face east, watching the sun rise over a world that would be unrecognizable to the man they represent. Amenhotep III sat on the throne of Egypt and presided over the wealthiest civilization in the history of the ancient world. He had everything: resources without limit, power without challenge, knowledge without precedent, and he could not prevent the loss of a single one of these things, because the loss was not caused by an enemy he could fight or a threat he could see. It was caused by the slow, silent, invisible processes that erode the foundations of all human achievement: the decay of materials, the disruption of institutions, the retirement of experts, the death of practitioners, the forgetting of procedures, the neglect of maintenance, and the supreme, devastating complacency that comes from believing that what exists today will exist tomorrow. What does Amenhotep III's story mean for us? The inhabitants of a civilization that is, by any measure, wealthier, more powerful, and more technologically capable than anything the ancient world could have imagined. The answer is uncomfortable, and it is made more uncomfortable by the fact that the parallels between Amenhotep's Egypt and our own world are not superficial. They are structural. We live in a golden age. By every material measure, human civilization has never been more prosperous, more productive, more interconnected, more technologically sophisticated. Our machines can do things that would have seemed miraculous to the engineers of any previous era. Our medical knowledge can treat diseases that would have been death sentences a century ago. Our communications technology connects billions of people across the globe in real time. Our economic system produces more goods and services than any previous system in human history. By every measure that Amenhotep III would have recognized: wealth, power, military capability, cultural production, diplomatic reach, our civilization exceeds his by orders of magnitude. And yet the knowledge that sustains our civilization is subject to the same vulnerabilities that destroyed his. Our knowledge is concentrated in specialized communities of practitioners. It is maintained by institutions that require continuous funding, staffing, and organizational continuity. It is embedded in economic and political systems that can be disrupted by war, revolution, pandemic, or economic collapse. It is recorded on media that degrade faster than stone, and in formats that become obsolete faster than hieroglyphs. The digital storage systems on which we rely have lifespans measured in years or decades, not centuries or millennia. The software that reads our data becomes obsolete within a generation, The institutions that maintain our archives are funded by political systems that are themselves subject to change, disruption, and collapse. There is a philosophical pause required here. A moment to consider the possibility that we, like Amenhotep III, are sitting at the summit of a golden age and mistaking the view for permanence. The feeling of security that comes from living in a wealthy, stable, technologically advanced society is powerful and seductive. It makes the idea of civilizational decline seem abstract, theoretical, something that happens to other people in other times. But the people of Amenhotep's Egypt felt exactly the same way. They lived in the wealthiest, most powerful, most sophisticated civilization in the ancient world. They had every reason to believe that their golden age would continue indefinitely. They were wrong. The digital revolution has introduced a new and largely unrecognized dimension to the problem of knowledge preservation. We generate more information in a single year than all of the ancient civilizations combined produced in their entire histories. We store this information on magnetic media, solid-state drives, optical disks, and remote servers maintained by corporations whose existence depends on continued profitability. The lifespan of these storage media is measured in years or decades, not centuries or millennia. A magnetic hard drive may last 10 to 20 years under ideal conditions. A flash drive may last 5 to 10. A compact disk may last 30 to 50, though under poor conditions it may degrade much sooner. Even the much vaunted cloud, which gives the impression of ethereal permanence, is in reality a network of physical data centers that require continuous power, cooling, maintenance, and upgrading to function. The software that reads our data is even more ephemeral than the hardware that stores it. File formats become obsolete within decades. The software that can read a document created in a word processing program from the 1980s may no longer exist or may no longer function on modern hardware. The encoding systems used to represent text, images, sound, and video change with every generation of technology, and backward compatibility is maintained only as long as there is commercial or institutional interest in maintaining it. The ancient Egyptians lost their knowledge because their papyrus decayed. We may lose ours because our file formats become unreadable. The institutional dimension of the problem is equally concerning. The libraries, archives, universities, and research institutions that maintain our knowledge are funded by governments and private donors whose priorities can change. The specialized communities of practitioners who hold the tacit knowledge required to operate our most complex technologies are trained by educational institutions that face their own funding pressures, enrollment challenges, and political uncertainties. The chain of transmission from master to apprentice, from experienced practitioner to novice, from retiring expert to incoming trainee, is as vulnerable today as it was in ancient Egypt. It is simply operating in a different medium, with different technologies, and at a different scale. But the fundamental vulnerability is the same. The knowledge depends on people, and people are mortal, fallible, and subject to the disruptions of politics, economics, and circumstance. The second implication concerns the specific nature of the knowledge we are most in danger of losing. Amenhotep's Egypt did not lose its gold. It did not lose its stone. It did not lose its monumental architecture. It lost its institutional knowledge, the administrative expertise, the diplomatic skill, the artistic mastery, the religious understanding, the tacit practical wisdom that animated the monuments and gave them meaning. The monuments survived. The knowledge that built and maintained them did not. We face the same asymmetry. If our civilization were to experience a significant disruption, the physical infrastructure would likely survive. At least in part, the buildings would stand. The roads would remain. The machines would endure, at least for a time. But the knowledge required to operate, maintain, repair, and reproduce those machines is held by a small number of specialists. The engineering expertise that designs our bridges, the medical knowledge that develops our treatments, the agricultural science that feeds our population, the information technology that connects our communications, All of this is concentrated in communities of practitioners that are far smaller than the general population that depends on their expertise. If those communities were disrupted, if the training institutions that produce new practitioners were damaged, if the economic systems that fund the research and development were interrupted, the knowledge could be lost far more quickly than most people imagine. The third implication is moral. It concerns our responsibility to the future. If we understand that knowledge is fragile, that golden ages are temporary, that the conditions that produce civilizational peaks are the same conditions that make those peaks vulnerable to collapse, then we have a moral obligation to take the preservation of knowledge seriously. Not merely the preservation of data, which is the relatively easy part, but the preservation of capability, which is far harder. Data can be stored on hard drives and backed up in the cloud. Capability requires living human beings who have been trained, mentored, and given the opportunity to practice their skills. The preservation of capability requires educational institutions, training programs, apprenticeship systems, and the economic resources to sustain all of them. It requires a commitment of time, money, and attention that is easily neglected when things are going well and easily abandoned when things are going badly. Amenhotep III's Egypt had all the resources it needed to preserve its knowledge indefinitely. It had the wealth to fund the institutions. It had the literacy to record the knowledge. It had the institutional framework to transmit the knowledge from one generation to the next. What it lacked was the foresight to anticipate the disruptions that would destroy that framework. It did not plan for the possibility that a future pharaoh would dismantle the temples. It did not prepare for the possibility that the scribal tradition would be interrupted. It did not build the redundancies and safeguards that might have protected its knowledge against the specific threats that eventually destroyed it. The Golden Age felt permanent. It was not. The temples of Amenhotep III stand in ruin on the banks of the Nile. The colossi of Memnon sit in the morning light, facing east, as they have faced east for more than 34 centuries. Tourists photograph them, guides explain them, scholars study them. But the world they represent, the world of the Golden Age, the world in which Egypt was the wealthiest, most powerful, most sophisticated civilization on earth, is as remote from us as the stars. We can see the monuments. We cannot see the civilization that built them. We can read the inscriptions. We cannot hear the voices that composed them. We can measure the stones. We cannot weigh the knowledge that shaped them. And in that gap between the monument and the meaning, between the stone and the knowledge, between the artifact and the understanding, lies the most important lesson that the ancient world has to teach us. That permanence is an illusion, that wealth is not wisdom, and that the Golden Age, for all its splendor, is always more fragile than it appears. In a storeroom of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, far from the crowds that gather around the golden mask of Tutankhamun, there is a mummy. It was found in 1898 in the tomb designated KV30, 5 in the Valley of the Kings, the tomb of Amenhotep II, where it had been reburied by 21st dynasty priests who were trying to protect the royal mummies from tomb robbers. The mummy was identified through the hieratic docket written on its wrappings as the body of Amenhotep III, the pharaoh who had ruled Egypt at its wealthiest peak. The mummy is in poor condition. It was badly damaged by the tomb robbers who plundered the original burial and by the centuries of exposure that followed. The wrappings are disturbed. The body is damaged. The face, which once bore the features of the most powerful man in the ancient world, is difficult to read. Modern CT scanning has revealed some details, dental problems, evidence of obesity in later life, signs of the aging that affected a man who lived to be approximately 50 years old. But the physical remains, like the archaeological remains, provide outlines rather than substance. They tell us that a body existed. They do not tell us the person who inhabited it. Amenhotep III built more statues of himself than any other pharaoh. He filled the temples of Egypt with his image, carved in the hardest stones, polished to a gleam, idealized and perfect. He wanted to be seen. He wanted to be remembered. He wanted the world to know his face, and in a sense, his wish was granted. His face is known. It is carved in quartzite and granite and alabaster, stored in museums from Cairo to London to New York. But the face is a mask. It is a surface. It is a representation of an ideal, not a portrait of a person. Behind the polished stone, behind the serene expression, behind the conventional poses of pharaonic iconography, the man himself is as unknowable as any stranger who died 3,400 years ago. The visitors who pass through the Egyptian galleries of the world's great museums encounter Amenhotep's face without recognition. In the British Museum, a colossal head of the king carved in red granite sits in the Egyptian sculpture gallery, its serene features gazing out over a room full of visitors who glance at it and move on. In the Luxor Museum, a magnificent statue of Amenhotep and the crocodile god Sobek shares a room with other masterpieces of New Kingdom sculpture, appreciated for their aesthetic quality but rarely connected in the minds of visitors with the extraordinary civilization that produced them. In the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, fragments of Amenhotep's statuary are displayed alongside the art of other periods, divorced from their original context, stripped of the theological and political significance that they were created to embody. These museum encounters illustrate the final irony of Amenhotep's quest for immortality. His statues have achieved a kind of permanence. They have endured for more than 34 centuries, surviving earthquakes, floods, wars, tomb robbers, quarrymen, and the slow assault of weathering and erosion. They will likely endure for centuries more, preserved by the climate, controlled environments of modern museums, and protected by the conservation expertise of trained specialists. But the permanence of the statues is not the permanence of memory. The statues persist. The meaning they were designed to convey does not. They are objects stripped of context, artifacts without explanation, faces without voices. They represent Amenhotep in the way that a tombstone represents the person buried beneath it. The name is there, but the life is gone. This is the final irony of Amenhotep III's legacy. He devoted enormous resources to ensuring that he would be remembered. He built the largest mortuary temple in Egypt. He produced hundreds of statues. He issued commemorative scarabs that were distributed across the empire. He erected stelae and inscriptions in temples from the Delta to Nubia. He did everything that a pharaoh could do with all the resources of the wealthiest civilization in the ancient world at his disposal, to anchor his memory in stone and gold and the institutional apparatus of the Egyptian state. And it was not enough. The mortuary temple is gone, quarried for stone by his successors. The statues survive, but in museums, stripped of their original context, reduced to aesthetic objects rather than the theological statements they were intended to be. The commemorative scarabs survive, but as collectibles, curiosities, small objects in glass cases that visitors glance at and move on from. The inscriptions survive, but they are readable only by a few thousand specialists in a language and script that has been dead for nearly 2,000 years. The institutional apparatus that was supposed to maintain his memory, the mortuary cult that should have performed rituals and made offerings at his temple for centuries after his death, ceased to function within a few generations. The system that he had relied upon to preserve his name and his deeds for eternity was itself a product of the Golden Age, sustained by the same wealth, the same institutions, and the same chains of knowledge transmission that sustained everything else. When the Golden Age ended, the system of commemoration ended with it. The system failed. The memory faded. The man who had more resources for self-commemoration than any other individual in the ancient world was forgotten by the very civilization he had led to its highest achievement.